Here we are again. That Chisholm kilt that I'm altering is still drying on the bench, so I just go to the next thing on the list and get to work again. This is Hunting Ross tartan, and customer is from away. He's down in the States, so we've done all of our consultation online. So it's good to be pleated to the brown line on the black. So to just show you a couple of things, so that when I'm looking at the cloth, I unwrap the cloth, and it's usually been folded, so I'll roll it up on a spindle to let it relax, let the wrinkles and such fall out of it. And then when I'm ready to start work on it, I inspect it. Now, generally, the weave will mark which is the face, the good side, and which is the good edge, but they don't always put the sticker down on the right side, because this is not the good edge. The good edge is over there. When I say good edge, this is the second best edge. Is still better than a tuck selvage, as far as I'm concerned. So there we are. So I'm just going to look at the cloth. This is the good side of the cloth. I've already inspected the other side, and I didn't see any knots. Knots are there for a reason. When perhaps the yarn is broken during weaving, they've tied it, and they've carried on again. But any, I won't call them imperfections, but any unique bits will be on the back side of the cloth. So this side's all looking pretty good. Now, I got the door open for some fresh air, because it's been very cold and rainy. Pardon me. Recently, but the weather's turned nice, so a little bit of fresh air while I can before the door is locked for the next several months. Okay, so I have his measurements: 43 waist, 43 hip. And again, even those are the same. We do have to give a bit of an A-line, because even if his body doesn't apparently have an A-line, we need to tailor it, because otherwise it's not going to hang properly. Okay, so right now, because his waist is 43, right now, I've just out of the blue, just from experience, I've decided at this point that his apron is going to be 22, and then let's say 22 and a half down at the hip. And we hadn't discussed it, but because he's picked the brown line on black as we're pleating to the stripe, each pleat is going to be centered on that. I then look at the apron and I think, where's the strongest element of the cloth? Well, it's pretty easy here. It's this package. I mean, you sometimes do see kilts, like Highland Light Infantry, for example, where the middle of the front apron is identified by the lack of a strong element. But generally, I'll ask the customer, do you want it like that? Do you want it like that? And almost everybody, 99%, pick the stronger element centered, because the second one, if you pick the absence of a strong element, sort of the anti-element, you get puzzled looks from people. So I've chalked out the front apron, and now tentatively, right? I might change this. This might wind up being, right now it's 22-21. It might wind up being 23-20, right? Don't know yet. So, and now I've tentatively picked the first pleat. And the reason why I've picked this brown line instead of that brown line is because I am paying attention to what sort of flash we're going to get when he walks, right? Do we want the brown flash? Or do we want the green flash? We're going to go for the brown flash, because it's a little more somber, right? So I've marked with X's. That's my first pleat. So then I go to the other end of the 8 yards of cloth, the 7.4 meters, and it's usually a few inches over, right? They never cut it exactly at 8 yards. They give you a bit extra. And initially, I had chalked out the inner apron so that it was centered on the the lesser element, because that'll give you one more repeat of the tartan to work with in the pleats. And I had done that. I had chalked it out, and then with this, I find that that was the original one. I find that I won't say the last pleat, but we have to think of a word for what this part is, where the apron and the pleat meet. Because if this is the last pleat, it's coming over to the same element of the cloth, and then the apron's coming to meet it. So I do this, and again, I'm just sort of, there's no hard and fast rule, really, right? I pulled the cloth over, and this is so much easier when you're pleating to the stripe. When you're pleating to the set, there's a lot more empirical give and take before you hit on exactly what that point is going to be. But I've chosen that because, well, the brown line, and when I fold it over, it's about a third of the total width of the pleat. So that's a nice deep apron pleat, which again is one of the features of my kilts. Then, having done that, marked that point, marked where the first pleat is, I then went through 1, 2, 3, all the way to the other end, and discovered that I had 32 repetitions, 32 maximum pleats. And again, I don't like an even number of pleats, because I believe, it's certainly true with me, that if I see a kilt with an even number of pleats, I don't see, to me, it's a little bit jarring, because I want to see a center pleat. And even though you didn't think it would be possible to see, I seem to be able to spot it, and I find it annoying. Particularly, and it's absolutely critical when you're pleating to the set, of course, because you must have the center of the front apron must be mirrored by the same center on the back on the center pleat at the back. So just for my default setting, I really try to avoid even number of pleats. So having marked it there, the center of there, and then 22 inches, and then marking, let's call it the meeting place, I then counted the pleats, and I found they were 32. Didn't like that. So what I did was I moved over a half set. So now the apron, the inner apron, is going to have the same features as the outer apron. It's centered on the strong element from that, and that means that from there I moved over one element. So the first pleat is now the meeting place. The first pleat from my first attempt is now the meeting place, and this is now my first pleat, right? I count them, and I'm sure I'm right. Yes, there's 31. Also, by moving it over a little bit like that, I have a little bit more tartan to play with here on the end. I can take, because I'm going to be taking at least 1 inch. Well, yeah, I can take 1 2-inch strip off to be the to add a little bit of fullness to the fringe on the edge, right? So that gives me a little bit of extra there. So I'm just going to arrange this now, just for a moment. I'm careful. The stuff doesn't wrinkle, but I'm still careful to to avoid giving it the opportunity to wrinkle. Okay. Now you notice I'm doing all of this before I reduce this in height, right? Okay, so now I take my magic sheet, 31 pleats. Where's my pen and my piece of paper? 31 pleats, 21 inches. Okay, looking at 31 pleats, 5/8 will give me 19 3/8. Or if I go 11/16, that'll give me 21 5/16. What I think I might do, I'm going to round down rather than go to 11/16. I think I'm going to round down to 5/8 to 19 3/8, and that'll just make the apron and at the end of it, I'll just make the apron a little bit wider, because of course, as a former military kilt maker, my default setting is an apron which is more than 50% of the total circumference. So I'm going to go from there. So okay, 31. So it's going to be 5/8 at the waist and 5/8 plus at the hip. And again, remember how I do that. I'm going to I don't have my... Oh, look at that, 5/8 sitting on the top, almost as though it's meant to be. Let's get this out of the way. So, where's my first pleat? At my first pleat at the waist, this is a sharp piece of chalk, and I have to make sure to remember to sharpen my chalk periodically. So at the waist, we're going to be measuring to the inside of the chalk line. And at the hip, I'm also holding it at a slightly different angle. At the waist, I'm making it as close to the spacer as possible, but at the hip, I've brought it up a little bit, so it's a tiny bit wider. So yeah, and here I'll be measuring to the outside of the chalk, because the width of my chalk line looks to be about a 64th of an inch. So that 64th times 31 will give us a nice, a sufficient A-line so that it hangs properly. And again, the reason why I consider this important is I do all of my shaping in the pleats. Many other kilt makers, particularly the old school army kilt makers, there was relatively little shaping in the pleats and a great deal of shaping in the apron, a very pronounced A-line. I don't like doing it that way. I prefer my method because I think it produces a finer look. It makes me a little bit cocky, quite frankly, because it's more work, but I'm not afraid of work. And I'm sort of keeping alive the old standards. This used to be common and now it's quite rare. So there we go. So I'm tidying up the old space. I'm confident with my measurements. Oh yeah, there's one more thing I'm going to do. And again, I've just fallen into this habit. I tend to mark lines that I'm cutting in white and lines that are reference marks in yellow. So the last thing I'm going to do, see there's the top of the kilt. Checking. I never go with that measure twice, cut once thing, because what happens if you're wrong the second time? Do you measure a third time and it's still only 2 out of 3? Yeah, there we go, 21. So what I'm going to do is mark that, because remember, I'm going to be drawing my top band from this. So marking that, I can be sure, without any doubt, that I'm realigning the torn off piece to the original, because this is, there's a variety of, the scale can vary a little bit, sometimes by up to as much as a 1/4 inch over the length of the piece. And I'll find that if I was using a top band and I was using this element here, then they may not line up precisely. So by doing that, later on when the time comes to put on the top band, I know just by a glance that I've correctly oriented the thing. So here's the part that used to bring people down the stairs wondering if I'd lost my mind and I was having a temper tantrum and ripping up a piece of cloth. Measuring one last time, 31. I'm going to give it about a 3/8 of an inch fraying allowance. Let's call it that. Okay. And as you can see, when I marked this, I did a mark like that to show that I was cutting it. I used that same half broad arrow mark on the other end when I show where the meeting place is, but it's in white chalk, so I know it's a cutting mark. And I make a generous cut with my shears, and then I pick it up, and this is the only way to get an absolutely dead straight line. Well, it's not the only way. I could do it with shears, but it would require careful attention and probably nearly 10 times as much time. There we are. And now I'm gonna roll this up into a ball, but you don't need to see me do that. I'll put it aside for the time being. I shall. One last thing I do, I relieve. This is the outside of the inner apron. I relieve that corner just ever so slightly. That'll be important later when I'm forming the apron several hours from now. Okay, now I can see all of my chalk marks. I know what's going on. And I'm being fairly gentle with it at this point because you can see it's unraveled a little bit. It's unraveled 2 or 3 strands. This cloth, because it's so wonderfully woven, it tends to self-seal after a few strands come off. But there are some cloths of lesser quality. Well, they'll just dissolve. The yarns will just keep floating off if you're not careful. So just going to keep doing this. Productive day. I've got another project on the go, which I'll do a video about later. I built a 3-hatch Bidarka kayak back in the early days of my partnership with Robert Morris of the Brewery Creek Small Boat Shop. We had a commission from a fellow, and this is pre-internet. People used to just find us from notes and notes left on billboards and conversations left in bars. And we built this kayak for a fellow in Belcarra, up Indian Arm, and delivered it to him soon after my son was born. And the thing's found its way back to me. So fellow offered it to me because he's had it for years. This isn't the original owner. I don't know how many owners it's gone through since then. But he offered it back to me, and I thought, just out of nostalgia, I took the thing again. So where are we here? Right. There's that first pleat. Now again, I don't start by sewing the apron to the first pleat, because at the end of it, if there's been any variation, even by as little as a yarn, which is about a little less than a 64th of an inch, half a millimeter, it adds up, right? So I wait till the end before I do the apron, because that allows me to account for any, let's not call them errors, individuality, yeah. So the first pleat, I mark down 1.5 inches. I take a kilt strap, center it on the chalk mark. I do the same thing here. Now I'm ready to start sewing. Away I go. Cheers.